And just to confirm, can you all see the slide? Perfect.
Yes,
I see the
can.
thumbs up. Okay, very good. So for those of you, I know Serena was able to attend, I believe, both the last two sessions. I think Chris was at the one in September, but this is a continuation of a series focused on managing your students' cognitive load. We all experience this. We'll do a brief review sort of as we get in, but today's primary focus is going to be strategies related to essential load. And I'll do, again, a brief review. If you've missed things from the previous month, or if we even a refresher is helpful, we'll do a brief review on that, and we'll go from there. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and proceed. This is just a look at where we've been previously. So back in September, we did just sort of an introduction on the topic. Last month, we talked about strategies to minimize extraneous processing. Again, today we're focusing more on strategies to manage essential processing. And then next month, we'll wrap up the series with the session focus on strategies to foster generative processing. So today, specifically, we have three main topics and three associated learning outcomes. So we're going to start with a review of key concepts. So things that we talked about in September, some things that we talked about last month. The goal there would really be ideally for you to remember the key learner processes, things that learners have to do in order to experience genuine learning. If they don't go through these processes, the likelihood of learning actually happening is limited. Then we're going to spend a little time talking about essential processing specifically, and the goal there is to understand what it is and how it impacts learning. In particular, how it's different from extraneous processing and generative processing. And then finally, and sort of the bulk of the session today is going to be on the strategies to manage essential processing. And the hope would be that you could at least identify one of these strategies to manage essential processing in any sessions that you lead. Chris, I know you don't necessarily work with students directly, but at least not know UWB, but perhaps there are ways that you can apply this information in your day-to-day work as well. Certainly they're focused on perhaps formal education settings like a classroom, but I think there are ways that it could be applied to other educational content that you're creating as well. So if you're doing any of those sort of things, these would apply. And just as I go through today's session, before I forget to mention, if you have questions, I do have the chat up. We're a relatively small group today, so you're certainly welcome to unmute and ask questions if you'd like to. Use the hand gestures. So if you have a question and you don't want to just speak up, you're welcome to raise your hand, and I have that pulled up as well so I can see it. If I don't see those things, I'm just going to continue on. So if you've got something you want to add, feel free to let me know. With that said, we're going to start with the review of key concepts. So things that we discussed back in September and a bit of what we talked about last month in October. So what we see on the screen here, if you haven't seen this before, this is slightly tweaked from what I presented in September, but this comes from Mayer's cognitive theory of multimedia learning. It may appear to be a little bit overwhelming the first time you see it. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but essentially all these techniques that Clark and Mayer have outlined are really associated with multimedia content, multimedia presentations. So the primary form in which a lot of information is shared in higher education, and certainly at OUWB, we're doing these multimedia presentations that generally include some visual elements on most likely a PowerPoint, but perhaps something that students see otherwise. And then the other big component of these presentations is going to be, of course, the spoken element, so what you are saying as a session presenter, as a session facilitator. And so we know that when we're presenting information in this manner, students are perceiving information through two channels or dual channels. That's the first principle of learning. And it basically means that students are intaking new information either through the ears, so things that they hear, or through the eyes, things that they see. And as you might be able to make out here, words, on-screen words, are processed through the eyes, and things that we hear, spoken words, are processed through the ears, whereas pictures, visual information is only processed through the eyes. So really what I want us to focus on this slide is the gold text. And these are the learner processes that we talked about previously that learners need to engage in to result in satisfactory learning. The idea that they would actually be able to retain knowledge or skills from a lesson. If they're not engaging in this process of selecting words and selecting images, and really the appropriate words and the appropriate images, and then subsequently organizing those words and images into a verbal and pictorial, sort of a coherent mental structure, a representation of what it is that they're seeing and hearing. And then once they've successfully created that mental representation, they need to integrate it with what they already know in long-term memory. So there's this process of integration. There's this process of recall that isn't actually noted here. But information goes back and forth between working memory and long-term memory. We're not just flowing from left to right here. There's actually a bit of flow from right to left once we get into long-term memory, because if we learn something but we're never able to recall it, then there's limited value there. So the key takeaway here is these are the learner processes that need to happen for learners to, again, retain information, retain skills, retain knowledge, so that they can transfer those skills and knowledge into novel situations. In a perfect world, if there were no demands on cognitive processing, students would be able to do this entire process or do that collection of 3 processes with relative ease. It's not a perfect world though, and we have limitations as human beings. So as learners engage in learning processes, again, that idea of selecting, organizing, and integrating new information, they're subject to these 3 different types of processing: extraneous processing, essential processing, and generative processing. And again, today we're going to be more focused on this essential processing piece. Last month, we talked more about extraneous processing. And in December, we'll talk more about generative processing. A brief recap on this: extraneous processing is cognitive processing that does not support the main objectives of a lesson. It's essentially the cognitive load caused by extraneous and essential processing. When it starts to exceed mental capacity, students aren't going to learn. There's just too much going on. And in circumstances where there's extraneous text, extraneous words being shared, interesting details, but things that don't really support the main point, that's where extraneous processing comes into place. It's a byproduct of poor instructional design or layout. So we want to try and limit those things. And that was what we really talked about last month. We'll look quickly at the principles covered last month on the next slide. And then again, we're going to shift into essential processing. On that note, essential processing then is cognitive processing aimed at mentally representing the core material of a lesson. And this becomes difficult when that core material is so complex, or there's so much of it that it exceeds learners' cognitive capacity. So even if we're presenting all the core material, there's nothing extraneous. Everything that we're presenting is what we're supposed to be presenting. It's possible that given the nature of our learners, what their zone of proximal development is, they may or may not be able to successfully mentally represent all that information at one time. It's either too much or it's too complex. And so that's where today's strategies are going to come into play, is how do we manage that essential processing? And then finally, we have generative processing. And again, we'll get into that more next month. But generative processing is cognitive processing that's aimed at establishing a deeper understanding of the core material. And that is really important, because that's going to be more associated with that idea of organizing and especially integrating. If students are able to sort of select the correct information, but they never engage in that deeper processing that happens when generative processing happens, they don't really build a successful they don't really build that mental representation of information that they need to. And so even though they've selected the correct content, they haven't really engaged in enough processing to result in successful learning. So that's why I said on the previous slide, learners really have to engage in all three of those steps: the selecting the right words and images, the organizing those words and images into some sort of mental representation, and then they have to integrate. I'm going to pause briefly so I can get a sip of water here, but are there any questions to this point?
No question.
Okay,
Thank
perfect.
you.
I see Chris saying no. Okay, hopefully it makes sense. Sometimes this can be a little deep if you're not familiar with these topics. Trying to be thorough, but also have some brevity
So
to balance it out.
I had a question actually.
Yeah, please, Akshata.
What is the measure? How do we measure whether these processing has occurred in the student? Like, what is the measure of, is it possible? Is it a measurable thing? Can we say, okay, students have gained maybe 20% of these extraneous processing or 100% of essential processing? Like, how do we set a number to it? Can we do that?
A lot of it's going to come down to giving your students opportunities to self-assess or doing aggregate assessment. So things like formative assessment, providing opportunities for students to pause, consider, because one of the things that we didn't explicitly talk about in that last slide, Akshata, was this principle of learning, the active processing. If we don't give students enough time to actively process the information that we're presenting, they're not going to be able to build those successful models that they need to. And of course, all learning is not going to happen within the scope of an individual session. So if we talk about sort of our large lectures, the ones that are happening in 203 and 204, most of them are about 50 minutes. And there's a lot of content to cover. And so obviously students are going to be responsible for some amount of learning outside of that time. But we want to do what we can as instructors to maximize the efficiency with which they can learn during that time. So going back to trying to address your question, to me, the biggest thing that needs to happen is there needs to be increased opportunities for students to both self-assess their learning in real time, but also to give instructors an opportunity to assess, do the students got this or not? So one way, a recent video that I did was on classroom assessment techniques. And a common one of those might be polling. So using something like Poll Everywhere or Mentimeter, or even just a simple raise your hands type poll, what do we think is the answer here? But that'll give you as an instructor sort of an aggregate sense, an overview of like, where are most of my students at with this topic? But it also gives students a chance to self-assess, like, do I really understand what's being shared or not? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
And as far as determining whether or not there's extraneous processing happening, determining, because you're right, it's difficult. And I talked to some instructors about this recently. You all are experts in your field, and you're obviously passionate about your subject, just as I'm passionate about topics like cognitive load. And it's easy to sort of get into the weeds without realizing, as the expert, that we're in the weeds. It is a balancing act. No lesson's going to be perfect. There's always going to be room for improvement. So seeking opportunities to get feedback from your students, not even necessarily about the content per se, but giving students an opportunity to say, hey, what aspects of today's lesson were most confusing to you? Or what is something about this lesson that I could change to improve the quality of learning? So giving students those opportunities to provide that sort of feedback as well could be super valuable as far as identifying areas where there might be some extraneous information being shared.
Yeah, I think, that makes more sense. So having a good dialogue with your students. Okay.
And again, it's tough because there's obviously, there's so much information that needs to be presented, and we're all operating under time constraints. I don't think we're going to fix all these issues at once, of course. But what we can do is to try and make these subtle little tweaks to how we present information. One, by applying some of the principles we're talking about in this series, But yeah, trying to make it a bit more dialogue. From what I've seen, I think in certain courses, this happens perhaps a little more naturally, or certain instructors, perhaps they're further along in that process. But by and large, I think there's room for improvement on how we have that dialogue with students, how they, how much opportunity they have to provide feedback about what's working and what's not working.
Thank you, Cody.
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead then. These are some of the principles that we covered last month. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but by and large, by utilizing these principles, which are for minimizing extraneous processing, you can, the general topic across all of these principles is that you can help students avoid selecting the wrong information. Again, that's information that does not support the main objectives of a lesson. A lot of this comes down to trying to weed out a lot of that. And that can be difficult because, again, we're passionate educators, we're passionate about our subject. To us, all this information is really, we might think of it as essential, but in certain circumstances, you may want to pause and look at information that you're sharing and say, how does this relate to my learning objectives for this session? Does it relate? Is it necessary? Can my students do what they need to do with this, without this information? And if you find yourself answering, yes, they can actually be successful on this lesson, they can achieve what they need to achieve without this information, well, that's probably an area where we want to withhold some of that information, and we can either share it as optional content, or if somebody brings it up, you can kind of have it in your back pocket to share as like a interesting tidbit. But a lot of this comes down to sort of being perhaps a bit briefer in the amount of information that we're sharing. So key points from this section, again, for learners to experience genuine learning, they have to engage in the selection, organization, and integration of words and images from your presentation. They have to organize those into that coherent mental structure, and then they have to integrate those real-time new mental representations of information. They have to integrate that new information into pre-existing information. That gets a little bit into schema theory, but that's the learner processes that need to happen. And as educators, we can assist learners with those processes by minimizing extraneous processing, managing essential processing, and fostering generative processing. And I think I just heard a camera snap, and that's totally fine. That actually just gave me a reminder that I want to attach a copy of today's presentation. So bear with me here for just a minute. I am sharing in the Zoom copy of today's presentation, a copy. So if you want that, that's going in the Zoom chat right now. It's just loading. You should have it in a couple seconds. All right, so moving on to like our second set of information then is a little bit of a deeper dive on essential processing, not too much deeper. Let me go back here, sorry. These Apple mouse, sometimes I move my finger across them and it just jumps stuff all over the place. But all things equal, learners should be able to learn it in much the same manner across opportunities, across modalities. So whether they're attending live in person, live via Zoom, or via Panopto or Moodle, a lot of this is going to apply across the board. As we know, however, though, different experiences do impact learners in different ways. So the point being, you don't have to worry too much about modality if you're applying these principles correctly. But you do want to be mindful of the fact, again, that learners are taking this information in different ways. So, somebody that's participating asynchronously may not have opportunities to ask questions live. And so, again, we just want to give them opportunities to address those questions. And likely you are, because we have discussion boards in Moodle, we have office hours, and students have to, utilize those resources as they exist. But it can't hurt to remind them from time to time. Peeling back the layers on essential processing. Again, essential processing is that cognitive processing that's aimed at mentally representing the core material of a lesson. It's impacted by the inherent complexity of the material itself, and it's really closely related to that learner process of selecting the relevant material. So last month, we talked about extraneous processing and the idea of us as instructors eliminating as much as possible the potential for students to select the incorrect information by simply not sharing it. But if we have a lot of really important information and it's not really extraneous, it actually supports the core goals of the lesson, it can be overwhelming for students to select the correct information. So again, that's where today's strategy is going to come into play. This becomes an issue when, again, the content itself is so complex that it's exceeding learners' capacity. So the solution to addressing too much essential processing is to use techniques that manage content complexity. And so the principles we're going to talk about are the segmenting principle, which is really related to this idea of chunking content into smaller pieces. The other principle that we'll talk about is the pre-training principle, which allows you to share certain bits of information ahead of time, potentially. And then we'll talk about the modality principle, which is really about how you present words. Because remember, words versus pictures, words can be processed through each channel, either the ears or the eyes, depending on how they're shared. So if we're speaking words, it's processed through the ears. But if we're putting words on screen, it's being processed through the eyes. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to sort of address some of that via the modality principle. So when too much essential processing is happening, it's related to content complexity. Those are the strategies that we're going to get into in a moment. I just went over this. But the key points in this section are really that when your content itself is too complex or too advanced for your learners, essential processing becomes overloaded. And so in those circumstances where you might realize, hey, this is a possibility, this may happen, you're going to want to apply some of the strategies that we're going to spend the rest of today's session talking about. So before we get into the strategies to manage essential processing, this is another good pause point. Do we have any questions right now? Okay, so we will continue on, and these are the strategies. Once again, segmenting principle, pre-training principle, modality principle, and we're going to talk a little bit more about them right now. So the segmenting principle, sort of the main idea here is we want to manage content complexity by breaking a lesson down into parts. This may not always be possible. You may have to get through a certain amount of content in 50 minutes. In fact, that's often the case. And if you don't have the autonomy or ability to apply this principle, well, fortunately, there are other principles that we can apply to manage essential processing. But this is a good one to consider where possible. And this may come into play more with asynchronous lessons. The nice thing about asynchronous lessons is students also have control of the pace at which information is digested, but they don't always, depending on what the student's level of motivation is, what their ability is to time manage, that may or may not work out in their favor. The idea here is, for the segmenting principles, we want to break larger lectures down into smaller bite-sized segments. So remember, if the content is there's too much volume of content, and we have the ability to break it down into bite-sized segments, try and do that. I'll visualize this for you in a moment, but where possible, if you're breaking stuff down into chunks, that's sort of the ID terminology for this. Try and align those chunks with the session outcomes for your session. So if you have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 learning outcomes, try and organize your presentation in such a way that there's 5 sections to it. I'm trying to model this a bit today. You know, we're kind of working through this presentation in chunks, and we sort of present the information at the front. I try to provide an opportunity to pause at the end of those sections. I provide a review of what we had just talked about. So it's sort of giving students that opportunity to process what it is that's been discussed before proceeding. And ideally, what happens then is once we've broken down a lesson into smaller chunks, each of those chunks should scaffold upon one another so that by kind of tackling stuff in smaller pieces, we eventually get to the larger goal that we might have for the lesson. This sort of naturally happens at a course level. Obviously, we can't cover all the content associated with the course in one lesson. So we're scaffolding lessons such that over the course of a week or 3 weeks or 5 weeks or 9 weeks, depending on the course, we're covering a lot of information. But you can apply that same level of thinking and design at an individual lesson level. All right, so this is what it might look like, sort of visualized. Occasionally what we have is a topic and, you know, learning outcomes are over here. This is a dashed line. I don't know if you can tell that or not, but that's supposed to be a dashed line. What I'm really trying to visualize there is that I know all of the lessons in OUWB are supposed to be supported by learning outcomes. By and large, what I see when I watch them is, yes, the learning outcomes exist. They're certainly on Moodle. The course coordinators do a wonderful job of making sure that they get on Moodle. And most of the time, faculty will present the learning outcomes as part of the presentation. What doesn't always happen, though, is I've seen in certain circumstances where we put that slide up on the screen for 10 seconds, and then we're off to the races. So yay, kudos. We showed the learning outcomes, but we didn't actually really preview them at all. And the learning outcomes, what they're intended to do is to sort of tell students, hey, at the end of this lesson, here's the knowledge you're supposed to have or the skills you're supposed to gain. It's generally by and large good practice to spend a little time actually previewing those because they should support and align the content that you're sharing during the lesson. And by extension, they should support and align to any activities that you might have involved or assessments that you might have involved. And when I'm saying assessments, I'm talking about those formative opportunities for students to practice their knowledge. If we're simply just sharing content the entirety of the lesson and students aren't engaged in activities and they're not engaged in assessment, they're actually pretty passive from a cognitive sense. They're not doing a lot of that active processing that we talked about back on that complex slide earlier in the presentation. So it's sort of a tangential conversation, but it's important too to remember that we want to give students opportunities to be actively or cognitively active. We want to allow them to actively process what it is that we're sharing. If we're just simply talking at them for 50 minutes, it's possible that that may not be happening, at least not in the confines of that 50 minutes itself. So what we have on the right then is a different visualization where we have the topic of the lesson, and this is not a dotted line. This is meant to indicate that before we get into any of these facts or concepts, we're spending time actually addressing what the learning outcomes are for the session. We're previewing them, we're talking about them. And pro tip, sort of what we talked about earlier, if we can organize our presentation in such a way that it's chunked out, where each segment of our presentation is associated with one of the learning outcomes that we said was going to be associated with this lesson, kudos, that's job well done. Because what's happening then is rather than sort of lumping all these facts and concepts, which, yes, they're all related to that central topic, but there's probably, if you did some cognitive task analysis, you could break down this larger lump of facts and concepts into smaller chunks and scaffold them in such a way that they're aligned with learning outcomes and they're all aligned with the topic. So that's really what we're looking for here with the segmenting principle, is taking this larger set of facts and concepts and topics that you're going to talk about in a lesson and breaking them down into smaller chunks so that students can more easily process those bits of information. A good real world example of chunking is how we share phone numbers. So if I were to tell you my phone number and just spewed out 10 digits as individual digits, you're far less likely to remember what my phone number is versus if I give you the 3-digit area code as one sort of number, the next 3 digits as one number, and the next 4 digits as one number. That's a common example of chunking that's pretty, prevalent in society. And study after study supports this idea that you're more likely going to remember a phone number if it's presented in 3 chunks versus 10 digits. Simple analogy there. And you might find yourself asking this question, like, how can I tell if material is too complex that it's going to overload learners' cognitive processing ability? Clark and Mayer address this in the text. They talk about a good way to gauge the complexity of a lesson as being this idea of tallying the total number of elements or concepts associated with a lesson, and then the number of interactions between those elements or concepts. The greater number of individual concepts and the greater the number of interactions between those concepts, the more complex your lesson is. That's the way that you can think about it. So you might actually write down perhaps on a piece of paper, okay, I'm going over 7 different unique concepts in this lesson. But if there's 2 or more interactions between each of those concepts, well, you start to add up quite a few interactions, and that beefs up the complexity rather quickly. So where you start to notice those natural breaks in concepts and those natural associations between concepts, try to segment those elements so that they're individually discussed or discussed in smaller pieces, and then try to connect those pieces one at a time, the next to the next to the next. That's that scaffolding process that we talked about. Doing that is effectively applying the segmenting principle, and it's going to, again, sort of manage the essential processing that your students have to go through. Yes, they're by and large going over the same information, but rather than presenting it sort of as all one lump sum, we're presenting it perhaps as 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 chunks, which are related to one another over the course of the lesson. There is evidence supporting the segmenting principle. This example comes from what they dubbed the lightning lesson. So Clark and Chandler presented a lesson on the formation of lightning and how that happens. And what they found was that when they sort of broke it down or segmented it or chunked it, there were 3 elements to that lesson. I'm sorry, more than 3. There were 5 elements to that lesson or concepts involved. So warm and cold air drafts, updrafts and downdrafts, positive and negative particles in the clouds, on the ground, leaders and return strokes. And you could actually break this down even further, because positive and negative could be separate, and then the segments, really what ended up happening is they found that there were 16 different segments. And those segments apply again to the individual concepts, but also the relationships between them. Sort of what I just stated there. So it's a good example. You might look at the formation of lightning and think, that's relatively straightforward, or we might even think of the formation of lightning as one concept. But when you actually start to break it down, you might find that there's actually a significant number of segments involved. And so it's a good practice to try and chunk that content in such a way that we're talking about the first thing, the interaction between them, the second thing, the interaction between them, And here's just some additional studies associated with the segmenting principle that have sort of concluded that, yes, this is a good principle to apply to learning, and it can result in improved learning between an experimental group and a control group. For the purpose of time, I'm going to proceed on to our next principle, which is the pre-training principle. And the key idea here is that we want to ensure to the extent possible, that learners know the names and characteristics of key concepts ahead of time. And this can be a nice alternative to the segmenting principle, especially in the real world context of I probably am not going to get more time to teach than I want or have. And I may not have enough autonomy to sort of make to segment stuff. So the pre-training principle is really about allowing students to engage in some of the processing involved in the lesson ahead of time. So I have a picture of, a coach and maybe some soccer players here. It looks like a soccer field on the whiteboard. So I'm assuming they're soccer players, but you might see a coach and players engage in sort of this pre-training ahead of time. Of course, there's regular training, but right before a match, they might, review some of the key concepts of how they're going to attack, how they're going to defend, et cetera, et cetera. There's evidence to support that this is generally more valuable for novice learners, but novice can be a sliding scale. So if we talk about this in terms of medical education, we would talk about M1 students, of course, being more novice than M4 students. So I wouldn't get too caught up on this per se, but the pre-training principle might be especially valuable in courses where you're engaging with M1 students, but also potentially M2 students. The other thing that you can do with all of these is you can sort of team or tag up some of these principles so that you might be using the pre-training principle also with maybe the segmenting principle or the contiguity principle that we talked about last month, the coherence principle, et cetera. So how do we apply this? When possible, again, and it's not always possible, but provide students with a resource ahead of time to introduce them to the key terms, names, or concepts that's sort of a precursor to the formal learning that's happening, again, during live sessions. So we're sort of allowing them, again, to engage in some of that processing ahead of time so that once they're in the session, it's not the first time that they're hearing about some of these things. Again, this is valuable, as all of these three principles are, in circumstances where the material itself might overwhelm cognitive processing. What evidence do we have to support this? So in a study by Mayer, Matthias, and Wenzel, they constructed a short pre-training episode during which learners saw a labeled diagram of a braking system, so like a car braking system. That's the image on the left there. During that pre-training, learners could click any part of the diagram, and when they clicked on a part, they were basically told the name of that part and some of its main characteristics. And so what happened was, in 3 separate studies, learners who received that sort of pre-training before viewing a narrated animation, they actually ended up performing better on a transfer test than learners who did not receive the pre-training. And they reported a median effect size of 0.90. And again, we can kind of see a graphical representation here that on subsequent transfer tests, those who received pre-training had more success on those post-transfer test than those who did not. So if you talk about this as it might apply to OUWB curriculum, this could be used both for asynchronous lessons, but also synchronous lessons. The example that we just talked about was that learners could first engage in some sort of activity that allowed them to click on these individual pieces and see what the parts were. So you could build something like that using H5P, for example, and have students engage in that sort of activity prior to reviewing maybe a video that you've recorded. But you could also have them do that before attending a lesson. And depending on, again, the complexity of what it is you're trying to teach them, building something like that wouldn't likely take more than an hour or 2. Certainly Serena or Akshata or Chris even, if you're interested in building that sort of content and you're not real comfortable doing that. I know, Serena, you've told me in conversations previously that you're not always the most comfortable with technology, but that is something that I can assist you with. So if that's something you're interested in and trying to apply the pre-training principle by using something like H5P, let me know, because we can definitely create some of those types of things. And again, we have evidence to show that doing that can be very valuable for your learners as a precursor to then a forthcoming or a subsequent formal session on it.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me take a brief pause here. We have one more principle to get into in just a moment, the modality principle. And again, just trying to be mindful of time, but do we have any questions on the segmenting or pre-training principles?
I just have a comment I put in the chat. I think the pre-training was something that never occurred to me before, but I think it's a great way to make sure that the students start at the same starting line.
Yeah, that's a good point, or at least give them that opportunity. So pre-training, I think, would by and large be optional. I suppose you could mandate it, but you're right, especially with some of the things that we're talking about with the M1 students, and something that I've gleaned from sessions that I've attended is we know that students are coming into medical education with pretty varied backgrounds. They're certainly coming from different institutions, they're coming from different majors, and so particularly with those M1 students, we understand that they don't have sort of that common starting point. So you're right, Akshat. I think that's a really good point, that utilizing something like this for some of the basic concepts, and knowing that this pre-training work principle works better with relatively novice learners. I think that's a really good observation. Any other questions or comments before we proceed? Okay, so our last principle for today then is the modality principle. It's essentially breaks down to, you want to present words as audio narration rather than as on-screen text. So we went back to that earlier slide. In fact, let me see if I can do this. Okay, so if we went back to this slide, remember, words can be depicted in two ways. We can speak words, and when we speak words, that information is processed through the ears. But when we present words as on-screen text, well, then we're processing that information. Those words are processed visually. And when words are paired with pictures or images or some other visual media, like a video or an animation, essentially what the modality principle is saying is that when you're presenting words as on-screen text in tandem with other visual stimuli, you're risking over a greater amount of cognitive processing than can be processed through the visual cortex. So what this is essentially recommending is that you spread out cognitive processing, allow some of the processing to happen through that visual cortex. So allow learners to visually pay attention to the visual stimuli on the screen, and then replace the on-screen text with verbal narration. So you're essentially engaging learners through two channels rather than one at the same time. You're more effectively, more efficiently sharing information. So it really boils down to, you want to try and avoid, or at least limit, on-screen text. And try to avoid reading what's on the screen verbatim. That actually gets into the redundancy principle. And I'm doing that right now. I'm very cognizant of that. It doesn't mean you can never do it, but you want to try and limit that. And so by applying the modality principle and sort of limiting the amount of words that are on screen, you're actually also going to be better adhering to the redundancy principle, which basically says is you want to avoid reading verbatim what's on the screen. So what does this look like? Again, here's another example. This comes from Moreno and Mayer, and they basically presented the exact same lesson. This one, I think, was on, this might also be a tweak on that lightning lesson and how that happens, but they presented the exact same visual imagery. So the picture on the left and the picture on the right here are exactly the same. The only difference between the control group and the experimental group was that the one group viewed the text on the screen. So they had to visually pay attention to the text, and they had to also visually pay attention to what it was they were seeing. Conversely, this group visually was able to pay attention to the imagery on screen while the exact same text was read to them. So again, they're basically more efficiently processing two different but related bits of information, because one set is being processed visually while the other set is being processed auditorially. That's really as simple as the modality principle is. It's that idea of replacing on-screen text to the extent possible with verbal narration. And when you look at a comparison of learning outcomes across those two different presentation styles, so this is related to what we just saw here, for those situations when the graphics were presented with narration, learning was better than it was with the graphics and on-screen text. Quick overview on the study. In their study, Moreno and Mayer found that students who viewed an animation depicting the steps, so this was lightning formation. When they viewed an animation depicting the steps in lightning formation along with a concurrent narration or on-screen text, that was the comparison they were looking for. What they found was that the words in the narration and the on-screen text were identical as they were presented, but on a subsequent transfer test, the students who, again, heard the narration versus having to also pay attention to the on-screen text, these were the results, basically. So the idea was basically, again, where possible, avoid on-screen text. And this is specifically in circumstances where there's also some other visual medium. So a picture, a video, an animation. If you simply have text, this doesn't really apply. You could be in violation of other principles like the redundancy principle, but if you have both text and images, that's where the modality principle applies. We want to engage our learners across two modalities versus one where possible. So through the eyes and through the ears. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Perfect. I don't know if I stated this specifically, but the students who received the narrated presentation generated 29% more solutions on a subsequent problem-solving transfer test versus those students who had to also read the on-screen text. And essentially what the determination was is that those students were being overwhelmed by having to, again, view two visual stimuli versus one visual stimuli and one auditory stimuli. So as we near the end of today's session, some potential questions you might ask yourself as you're approaching session design and some potential solutions would be, so if you're able to stretch the material out over multiple lessons, and I am very cognizant of the fact that that may not be possible in most situations, but if it is, consider applying that segmenting principle. If you can take a complex topic and break it into 2 lessons versus 1, chances are your students are going to have better success. If that's not possible, consider, can you provide certain information ahead of time? Can I provide some sort of guide or advanced organizer? Advanced organizer is essentially an outline, but you remove certain things. And the idea is that students sort of fill in the blanks as they go along. It helps you sort of present information in a structurally related way to one another, and it keeps students engaged because they want to fill out. It might be more common in like elementary and middle school, but for complex material, it might very well be beneficial for medical students as well. But there are other sorts of things that you can apply for students ahead of time. I think the example we talked about was some sort of clickable content, like something you might develop in H5P that goes over, again, sort of the main names and characteristics of those things. Say we were looking at the heart as an organ. If we gave students a clickable picture of the heart, and we were able to say like, hey, this is the aorta, and here's the ventricles, and please don't judge me on my knowledge of the heart offhand, but if we gave them that opportunity to kind of click through and a little bit of information, and then they went and participated in the corresponding lesson, they're going to be better prepared. and less overwhelmed during that lesson. And then finally, if your slides are too busy, there's too much on-screen text, apply the modality principle. And that might be the one that's probably the most viable for a lot of faculty. And it's honestly not that difficult. What I try to do is I try to be mindful of these principles. I try to apply them to my own lessons. I try to model what I hope faculty are doing. So if you have on-screen text, don't just delete it necessarily. I like to put my on-screen text in the notes. You might be able to tell at certain points during this presentation, I'm actually reading the notes of my slide because I'm trying to remember to say everything that I wanted to say. And the evidence again supports where I can replace on-screen text with verbal narration in those circumstances where I'm also presenting some sort of visual on the screen. That's going to have a positive impact on learning. So those are today's principles, all associated with that idea of trying to manage essential processing, allowing students to select the correct information so that they can eventually engage in that process of organizing that information and integrating it. And that's where we'll sort of lead off next month. Next month, we're going to talk about strategies to foster generative processing. And that gets you more into those learner processes of organizing the information that they've selected, and then by extension, integrating the new knowledge that they're forming with pre-existing knowledge. And so the principles we'll look at next month include the personalization principle, the multimedia principle, and the engagement principle. So these are some of the references from today's lesson. Those links, which are in the PDF copy that I sent to you in the chat. So if you'd like to download a copy of today's presentation, you can do that. They're all permalinks from the OU library, going to the direct chapters. So some of the visuals that I pulled today are right out of that text. So if you want to know more about these things, all of this is coming out of the book by Clark and Mayer, E-Learning and the Science of Instruction, Proven Guidelines for Consumers and Designers of Multimedia Learning. It's an interesting text. You wouldn't necessarily need to read it verbatim, but if you want to know more about one of these principles that we talked about today, here are the specific chapters that we talked about. Chapter 2 is more sort of a precursor that's sort of more related to the first chunk of information we went today, but that's a really great chapter. It provides a really good overview for some of the broader topics associated with what we've been discussing these past few months. Otherwise, thank you all for attending today. I hope you found this valuable. I hope you found this to be at least a decent use of your time. I do invite you to participate in a brief survey, and I'm actually going to share that in the chat right now. I do realize we're a relatively small group, and you might find that it's not anonymous, but I don't think there's anything that I can glean from it to be like, oh, Akshata didn't like my session or Serena didn't like my session. That's not really my goal. Honestly, my goal is to determine, was this valuable or not? Is this something that we should continue doing? And if so, what insights can I glean from the audience to improve it for next time? So with that said, I hope you found today's session valuable. I am very happy to stay on for a few more minutes if you have questions. But again, I also want to be mindful of time. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording at this point. But if you have questions, feel free to let me know.